Judaizers. But now we blow the shofar. Some people wear tallits. People want to learn Hebrew. People are observing the feast days. Why? Hebrew jewelry. Why? Oh, it's a fad. No, you see, it's just taken about... We're into the third day. And the graft has taken hold. And the same fruit that grows in the parent tree is starting to show up on those grafted branches. And do you know why? Because the Messiah came to gather in the exiles of Israel. He came that the two could become one. Paul says in Ephesians 2 that the Messiah's sacrifice has literally, this is what it says, melted the middle wall of partition. He is referring to that wall of partition that stood in the temple that separated the court of Israel from the court of the Gentiles. If you were Gentile, there was only so far to God's presence you could go. But when you got to the court of Israel, you couldn't go in there. There were sentinels and guards stationed there. My understanding is there was a sign that threatened you. But the Messiah melted it. There's now no distinction. He's dissolved the enmity, and of the two, He has made one. Why? Because Abraham doesn't have seeds. He has seed. You are the sons of Abraham. Which son? Ishmael? Isaac. Isaac? Okay, which son of Isaac? Esau or Jacob? And what was Jacob's name? Israel. That's who we are. But we haven't acted like it for a long time. Why? Because we didn't recognize the entirety of what the Messiah come to do. We didn't recognize it. Now, there's another passage of Scripture we want to look at here in Romans 11. It's very important. It says, let's go back to verse 25. For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery. Red flags should go up. You should be paying attention right now. There is something He is going to reveal to us. And it is this. For this reason, lest you should become wise in your own opinion. If I could paraphrase that, He said, I want to reveal something to you because the temptation is going to be there to let your opinions blind you to the truth of what I'm about to reveal to you. Do you remember when I opened this message, Yeshua was standing eye to eye with men who should have known but did not recognize Him. And I am strongly suggesting to you that that was due in part to the fact that their theology had blinded them to the truth. They thought things should happen according to their plan, A, B, C through Z. And when it didn't, they didn't accept it. And we're living in a day and age, ladies and gentlemen, where, again, if we allow our theology to do this, we will miss it just like they did. And that's why those who are led of the Spirit are the sons of God. Now He says, I don't want you to be wise in your own opinion. So I'm going to reveal to you the mystery. And this is the mystery. That blindness in part. Now what does that mean? Not total blindness, right? But partial blindness. Partial blindness has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. What is the fullness of the Gentiles? Let's deal with that. First of all, the fullness. The word fullness in the Greek text, it means completion. Completion. And we can look at that several different ways. Some people think that it has to do with numbers, and it may very well be. But I also understand that many times passages of Scripture can have at least dual applications. It is not necessarily limited to numbers. It may have another meaning. Allow me to suggest to you that the fullness, the completion, has to do with the fact that now the fruit of the natural tree, of the natural branch, is beginning to appear on those branches that have been grafted in. Because that branch grafted in is done, that happens with the sole purpose that that branch is going to produce fruit. And yes, I understand all the great things that have happened throughout the history of the body. I understand all that. But do you also understand we're living in a day and age when those things that were concealed are now being revealed? Do you understand that? We are being completed. You may not agree with that, but I believe that is a possibility here. The word Gentiles is the Greek word ethnos. The Hebrew equivalent of this word would be the word goyim. Goyim, Gentiles or nations. The words come in literally mean to appear or to arise. In other words, when you see the completeness of the goyim, of the Gentiles arise, then you know it's a sign that all of Israel is about to be saved. But now let me remind you again, Paul was a rabbi. Paul was a rabbi. This man knew the Scripture. And so once again, he didn't just pull this phrase, fullness of the Gentiles, out of thin air. There is a biblical reference for it. Let's go to Genesis chapter 48. Genesis chapter 48, we're going to look at verse 19. Israel is soon to die. He's been reunited with his son Joseph. And he's introduced to Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob, do you know what Jacob does? He adopts them. He adopts them. He makes them his sons. Read the text. In fact, he says, they shall be just as Reuben and Shimon. In other words, just as if they were my two boys, I'm adopting them. They're going to be my sons. And that's why Manasseh and Ephraim are counted in the 12 tribes of Israel. But in verse 19, what happens is he's going to bless them. And of course, you know the story. He reaches out to put his head on Ephraim, the younger. And Joseph says, no, Father, he's the youngest. You want to bless Manasseh. And Jacob says, son, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. And by the way, I have to tell you this. Manasseh means forgetful. To forget. Why? What would Joseph want to forget? All the suffering, all the pain, all the anguish, all the hurt that had been inflicted on him. All the things of the past. And so he has this son, and he names him Manasseh, because I want to forget the past. And he names his second son Ephraim. Fruitful. In fact, it's in the plural form of the word, to be doubly fruitful. Why? Because he said, I'm not looking at the past, I'm looking ahead at the future. And that's what Ephraim means. And so Jacob says, son, I know what I'm doing. And he puts his hands upon Ephraim, and he says, the younger brother is going to be greater than he, speaking of Manasseh. And speaking of Ephraim, he says, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. Now, in Hebrew, that phrase, multitude of nations, is milo hagoyim. And literally means fullness of the Gentiles. Fullness of the Gentiles. Now, his seed is going to become the fullness of the Gentiles. Do you know what I think this means? At least in part, because I don't have time to tell you all of it. But in part, what this is dealing with is the adopted sons. The adopted sons are playing a role in this fullness or completion of the Gentiles. And the adopted son is named what? Ephraim. And what does his name mean? Fruitful. Why are wild olive branches grafted into a tree called Israel? Because it's understood there's going to be fruit produced here. Understand?